As you know, the mayor has been very clear on this for months. You cannot camp out in New York City. As you can see behind me, there are migrants living in tents. Now, the city has been moving tens of thousands of people.
So every 30 days, adults in the city's asylum shelters get kicked out and are effectively homeless. Critics say these evictions are inhumane, and now people with nowhere to go are building encampments all over town. Or at least they were until the city decided to clear them out permanently.
Dozens and dozens of migrants who, instead of moving on after their city-funded shelter stay ended, set up a tent encampment outside the Randall's Island mega shelter. There's a barber who gives haircuts, people who sell food, others who cook meals for their families.
And we do want to show you the dismantling of that large encampment we just showed you. That encampment was here all throughout the day, and then the police department, the parks department, they rolled on through. All of the migrants and the folks that were hanging out outside basically had no other choice but to leave.
His name is Amadou, and he lives beneath a tree surrounded by what little clothes he has. He tells us he's been homeless in New York for more than a year.
Park workers tell me the waterfront tranquility and their safety took a big hit with the opening of the migrant shelter last year.
All in the span of 1 8-hour workday, me and other female staff has been harassed.
There's 2 charter schools and a regular public school. The migrants are so everywhere. I guess the teachers got scared.
He says the joggers and bird watchers don't come out anymore either, and that the climate of aggressive intimidation is to blame.
So New York City is now on a mission to stop the very people it made homeless from building encampments. But what nobody's talking about is that even though the city has spent over $5 billion on housing for new arrivals, no amount of money in the entire world could house the entire world. It's simply impossible. Yet sadly, that's exactly what New York has been trying to accomplish since the day this crisis started. And as bus after bus arrived carrying passengers from the border, the city's shelter industrial complex sprung into action. Formerly bankrupt hotels were turned into emergency housing facilities, generating millions of dollars per month for their owners. And although these were supposed to be temporary when the flow of asylum seekers fleeing poverty did not stop, the city decided to erect massive tent shelters in the middle of various public parks. But the problem is there isn't enough room in New York City for everybody who wants a place to stay to get one. And even those massive tent shelters are now maxed out, leading to people experiencing homelessness sleeping on our streets and in our parks with nowhere else to go. And that brings us to the real reason why New York City's homeless population is exploding. Our right to shelter laws, which exist to stop people from living on the streets, critics say are now the very reason people are living on our streets. Because New York's unique right to shelter rules make it one of the most popular destinations for asylum seekers anywhere in America. Where else can you get off a bus and immediately receive a place to stay for 30 days? Yet critics say the result of those generous policies is that they only make this entire humanitarian crisis worse. As instead of our shelters helping people get back on their feet, the only thing they do is force people to live on the street. Yet many of our leaders remain convinced that this is the best thing for the thousands of people traveling to New York City by bus right now, who don't realize that 30 days after they get off their bus, they could be living in a cardboard box or in a tent down by the river. So here we are at the Port Authority bus terminal, the cheapest destination for any traveler trying to get to New York City. And every month, thousands of asylum seekers still arrive at this terminal, and since they're all new arrivals, they're guaranteed an immediate placement in one of the city shelters, which does keep them from having to live on the street, but as you're about to see, forces the people inside those facilities to live on the street.
It's a problem that's difficult to solve, especially for a city that has gone the extra mile in providing services to the more than 200,000 asylum seekers who have flocked to the Big Apple. But a tent city, people sleeping on the ground, is not something.
So the entire reason that we now have tent encampments is because of the misguided way critics say New York City applies its right to shelter housing mandate, which guarantees room and board temporarily to anyone who asks. Because the rules say shelter is a right everyone has on a temporary basis, which means everybody who gets off a bus immediately gets a placement, but it also means that after your stay expires, you've got to move out and get back on a bus and go somewhere else. And after you are moved out of one of the shelters, you can't just go back and ask for another placement. No, you're actually barred from doing it, and since not everybody is able to leave town and go somewhere else, a lot of people are staying in town, making these encampments all over the city. And the only way a system like this is possible is if the people boarding buses headed to New York City have this idea that after they come here, that will not be their experience. experience. Yet the sad reality is that in 30 days, many of the people who arrive at this very same terminal will be homeless, living on the streets.
On the outskirts of a soccer field, migrants from South America are living in tents and drying their clothes in the sun after washing them in the East River. Still others are gathered outside the Randall's Island shelter, claiming they...
You know, as unfortunate as this is, I just cannot imagine that the people who are now in that situation came here fully expecting that that would be the end result of their attempt at the American dream. And that East River, that's an extremely polluted waterway. I mean, you can technically swim in it if you want to, according to local officials. Apparently, for years, it was a dumping ground for garbage, and when our sewers overflow, the raw sewage flows right into that river. And now the question is, would the people getting off of these buses ever have gotten on them had they known that this would be the result of their journey? Probably not. And this is where the city's right to shelter mandate gets a little bit controversial because, you know, when people get off a bus and they need somewhere to stay, yes, for 30 days they are not homeless, but oftentimes that's not enough for people to make new plans and get back on their feet, which is why they're now staying here locally. And the way right to shelter works is it's just not designed to house people for as long as they must need. Yet critics say it's being offered and presented as if it is a one-size-fits-all solution to homelessness in our city, which sadly makes this crisis more of a human recycling program than an actual solution to the problems many of these people are facing. Which not only means the very people whom this crisis is named after do not benefit from it, it also means that for many of them, their situation does not change at all from the moment they arrive to when they get kicked out of those shelters. In fact, some say that it's actually worse because they've spent money and wasted time coming here for something that never ended up materializing, and now they got nowhere else to go.
We don't want to be insensitive.
Mayor Adams on what has become an unanticipated problem. There's a barber who gives haircuts, people who sell food, others who cook meals for their families.
So that encampment area, it's now been cleaned, but it was essentially a tent city outside of the tent shelter where many of those people had been living with pretty much its own little economic system going on. And you had tents, you had people paying for things like haircuts, you had people cooking food. In many ways, it was like a miniature version of New York City. Now that reveals a couple different things. First, it reveals that the people in the shelter system want to work if they can. It also reveals that they have money to spend for basic necessities, but probably not enough money to afford a $5,000 plus apartment in this city. There's just no way that's gonna happen for many folks, which is why they're living on the street, not in apartments. And what's crazy is here we are offering shelter to people in a city that is so expensive that after they get out of the shelter, they really have no means of providing for themselves unless they have a very well-paying job. Look at this, $100,000 a year. That gives you about $36,000 of spending power. That is an almost impossible system to work with if you're just coming here, just getting started, and you don't have a $100,000 a year income. And I get it, New York City has a lot of high net worth individuals, and it's very sad that in a city with so much wealth, there are certain people that have to sleep on the streets, but that system of keeping people off the streets puts them right back on the streets. It's broken down. It's not working the way that it was intended to work, and critics say that's why it's failing so many people. But now that that encampment's been cleared out and all of those people are gone, one has to ask the question, where have they gone? Because we haven't heard reports that those very same people were moved into facilities where they could live with a roof over their heads.
If we shift over here, you're looking at what really is an empty space, but this was full of people earlier, vendors, folks hanging out, folks living, and it was largely a non-contested.
So I don't know what's more alarming, the fact that all of the people that were living in tents outside of that shelter have been displaced and are living probably in similar conditions elsewhere in the city, or that the city allowed that massive encampment to get built in the first place. All those people out there struggling, how long did it take for them to build all that? It must not have happened in one evening, and yet the authorities stood by and did nothing while that was being set up, which is strange because for months now our leaders have been assuring us that those evicted from its shelters were moving up, not just moving out. And although the city has data showing that about half the people who it evicts from its shelters do not come back, it doesn't really have a record of where those people are going. But now we know where they're going, to the parking lot or the park right outside the very shelter they just got kicked out of. And the frightening reality of this is although these evictions might decrease the number of people who are in the city's shelters and are classified as asylum seekers, it's increasing the number of people living on our streets and who are now classified as homeless New Yorkers. So it's like offloading one humanitarian crisis into another humanitarian crisis and giving it a different name, but it's the same people who are suffering. But even though this is really hurting the lives of the people who it directly affects, there's a hidden cost to New York City that's also making things a lot worse for people who are also in a vulnerable position of their own, and nobody's talking about it. are in one of New York City's many publicly accessible parks. This one happens to share a plot of land with the New York Public Library, and it's got a whole bunch of purposes other than just sitting around, lounging around, enjoying some nature in the middle of this concrete jungle. And critics say that the mismanagement of the Randall's Island shelter has changed the potential use cases of that park in a way that does not necessarily benefit everybody.
Park workers tell me the waterfront tranquility and their safety took a big hit with the opening of the migrant shelter last year. They say unauthorized tent encampments, complete with electrical appliances hooked up to lampposts, are a fixture, and now they're worried about...
So as the city allowed these encampments to get built up outside of the Randall's Island shelter, encampments which are against the law to build, other types of lawlessness started spilling out into the park itself. And this isn't a byproduct of the asylum crisis so much as it's a byproduct of the city's tolerance in general for lawless behavior. And here you've got a situation where park workers are trying to keep the place clean so that everybody can use it, but they're being intimidated into not being able to get up in the morning and go to work and do their jobs out of fear for their personal safety. That's ridiculous. Which reveals that whatever police presence is in this park is insufficient to deal with the increased number of people who are there, because as your population increases, you will have more crime. Doesn't matter where those people are from, and whatever police they have must not be enough. On top of that, there are others who say that the lawlessness in the park has deprived the surrounding community of its ability to use it. For example, there are soccer fields out there in the park, but who's going to try to play a pickup game on the weekend if your stuff might get stolen, or if there might be fights or other types of violence happening nearby?
Speeding mopeds and scooters, a lot of just kind of littering, trashing of green spaces.
All in the span of 1 8-hour workday, me and other female staff has been harassed.
So the crazy thing about this is that these parks employees, they're city employees, and it's their employer, the city's job, to keep that park safe by having a police presence there, at least enough of one to make sure that everybody can still use the park, and that's not happening, which means the city's not even able to protect its own personnel. And you've got a situation where people are not only building encampments, but using the river as a washroom, which is incredibly sad for two reasons. First of all, it's allowed to happen. Second of all, nothing's being done to help those people who are obviously in distress and who came here under the impression that they were going to get help and got it for a period of 30 days before being evicted. Now look, can New York City afford to house the entire world? Absolutely not, but they've invited people here who had a place to stay and now don't, which is really unfortunate. And even though the police removed all those encampments from the park, there's no guarantee those encampments won't be back as soon as the police leave. Plus, this is also affecting another group of people who have no say in the matter whatsoever.
It's hurt thousands of city kids since it was built right by Field 81, which was their only place for gym classes.
There's 2 charter schools and a regular public school that used to use 81 Herc. They used to come and then walk down here, but I guess the migrants are so everywhere. I guess the teachers got scared, so it's like...
So what most people don't know is that schools in New York, they're not like schools in other parts of the country. They don't typically have a lot of space because in New York there's not a lot of space, and if you have a public park like Roosevelt Island that has lots of open space, soccer fields and other equipment, playgrounds and such, schools will use that, and apparently several were, as a place for outside activities for the kids, but apparently they've stopped coming by according to the people in the park. And although those encampments have now been cleared from the park, that was a critical mass of people. And the big question that everybody has now is, where will those encampments spring up next? Will they go back to the park once the police leave? That's a possibility. Will they be dispersed throughout the city, ending up in other areas of town? That's also a possibility. But the likely answer to the what and where of the next set of encampments is probably down to how sanitation is going to go about handling them. Because whenever encampments get cleared out, it's usually the sanitation department that does the clearing out by boxing everything up and throwing it away. And the sad reality is that nothing is likely to be done for many of these people who were invited here and were then displaced. What's probably going to happen is that as new encampments pop up, the city is going to go around knocking them down, displacing those people, and just kind of playing whack-a-mole every time there's an encampment. Up, shut it down over here, up, shut it down over there. And they're going to play this little game with this humanitarian crisis until the weather prevents people from camping outside anywhere in the city, like it does every year at a certain point. And city officials know that all they've got to do is make it until late November in order for these encampments to go away entirely for about a period of 6 to 8 months. And what that means is, as generous as the city's right to shelter policies might appear to be, the city isn't implementing them in a way that actually cares for the needs of the people who come here for as long as those needs exist. It's just temporary care for needs that may be there for a lot longer than 30 days. Yet the people coming here aren't under the impression that that's how their situation will be. Perhaps they think that their plight will be better than that of the people who came before them. And maybe they'll figure out how to get integrated into New York City in a way that their predecessors haven't done. Either way, the idea of traveling to New York for a 30-day stay in potentially a former luxury hotel or even one of the big tent facilities would probably be less appealing if people knew that they would end up jobless and homeless at the end of that 30-day stay. Do you think that's what's going on? Are city officials not spreading the message that the type of care people will be getting here is only temporary and that many people remain homeless and jobless after they get here? How would you reform the shelter system, and what would happen to all of the people who've come here thinking they had a place to stay and now are in an even tougher situation than they were when they arrived? Let me know. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you in the next video.